Well, hello everyone and welcome. And I'm going to immediately, my name's Tim Bryce. I'm part of the webinar team. I'm going to hand things over to Miss Becca and she's going to kind of run things for us today. But I do want to welcome everybody to our presentation. Miss Becca, take it away.
All right. Yes. Hello and welcome everybody to the National Weather Association's Webinar Wednesday. Thank you everyone for joining us. Yeah, my name is Becca Mazer and I'm the chair of the Professional Development Committee, your host, along with Mr. Tim Bryce, who is a rock star member of our webinar team. So first things first, you can participate in the discussion here today on Twitter using the hashtag the hashtag NWAWebWed. You can also ping our Twitter handle as well at NWAS. So you can also send in your questions via the YouTube feature, the chat feature, which is on the right-hand side of the YouTube screen. So please go ahead and send those in throughout the presentation and we will ask those questions at the end. So today our speaker is Matt Bolton. He is a member of the NWS Diversity Committee. Looks like Jennifer joined us as well. So welcome, Jennifer. She is also, that's Jennifer Hogan. She is also a member of the Diversity Committee. They will be exploring the human personality using the 5-factor model and how it can apply to the meteorology community. This is such a fascinating topic and one that we as meteorologists and communicators of weather information perhaps don't think about all that often. So, all right, Matt, the floor is yours.
Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm Matt Bolton, undergraduate in psychology at St. Leo University in Central Florida. I'm a senior. I'll be going to graduate school in the fall. So with that, we will get started. And there's my Twitter handle, email. You can contact me for more information afterwards if you'd like. So personality, what is it? It is an individual's. Yes.
Oh, sorry, we can't see your slides right now. Can you?
Oh, can you not?
Not yet.
Screen share.
Yeah.
Oops. Technical.
No worries.
There we go.
Okay. There you go. All
Perfect.
Right. There you go. Now you've got my contact info and Twitter handle. All right. So personality, what is it? It's an individual sustaining behavioral traits over the course of life. It's your general behavioral propensity, what you're predisposed to. It's not to be confused with mood, which is a person's moment-to-moment behavior and how you feel. And this sounds familiar. Meteorologists, you study weather. Weather can be thought of as similar to mood. Personality can be thought of as similar to climate, weather over time. That's an analogy I like to use a lot in this work. So with that, I will go into the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which many viewers may be familiar with. It was based off ideas originated by psychoanalyst Carl Jung back in the early 1920s. And Jung had this idea that there are basic psychological types that basically define behavior. And so Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Myers actually, they popularized Jung's ideas and gave us the Myers-Briggs type indicator that we have today that many people use in the workplace and elsewhere. But they were both amateurs to psychology. Briggs her background was agriculture and education, and her daughter was a fiction writer. And Briggs began popularizing Jung's work in 1926. And then it was her daughter who really took things to the next level and did some theorizing of her own to give us the type indicator. Excuse me. So Jung's ideas, they weren't based in scientific study, but rather in observation, a lot of introspection. And Jung believed that people were basically either introverts or extroverts. And so introverts, that idea, the idea of introverted, extroverted has endured. But it was Jung who coined those terms. And he believed that you either were internally focused or externally focused. And you had basically, with this whole concept, the idea of cognitive functions. And so you had judging, which was thinking and feeling, perceiving, which deals with sensation and intuition. And the idea was that these manifest either in an internal or external way. So you can see here from the chart, I won't go through all of it, but I'll linger here for a few moments as I talk about it. You can see how the MBTI works, and just go through that. And many of you may be familiar with it. Maybe you've taken it as part of a workplace entrance testing or some other background testing. But you can see the different functions and types here. And moving right along, the MBTI, I'll have a little bit of humor here. ENFP, INTJ relationships, they're the supposed golden relationship. INTJ is supposed to be the rarest type, something like only 2%. And they're very, very logical, whereas ENFP, more emotional. And so it's like a cat trying to solve a Rubik's Cube. I haven't decided whether I'm the cat solving the Rubik's Cube. I'm not quite sure which type is solving the cube there. Haven't made that decision. But it's not scientifically rigorous. There are significant problems with its construct validity, so that it doesn't measure necessarily what it's supposed to measure or what it says it measures. And it also doesn't produce consistent results. I've taken it a few times, just for giggles. And I've come up with consistent results because I've answered the same way every time. I'm pretty consistent. But other people I've spoken to, they've said, "Oh yeah, I took it once. I was an ENFP. Next time I was an ISTJ." So it's not as rigorous and has some construct problems there. So then, what do psychologists use? What's a more scientific model for personality? And that would be the 5-factor model, also known as the Big Five. It's the main theoretical view of personality today, and there were a few different people involved in its construction and theorization. We had Costa and McCrae, who came up with the 5-factor model, and then we had Goldberg, who came up with the idea of the Big Five. Now, 5-factor model and the Big Five are empirically similar. So they're measuring the same kinds of things, but they're conceptually distinct. So there are a few different terminology differences between them, for example. But for the most part, they're synonymous in the psychological literature. We refer to the 5-factor model or the Big Five. People generally know what aspects of personality we're talking about. So a few technicalities on personality. You have traits, which are they're global. So they're stable across time and across situations. Something like when we say a person is more agreeable, for example, that's an example of a global trait. And then you have facets, which are specific aspects of those broad traits. So an extroverted person, extroversion would be the trait, and then a facet of extroversion might be warmth. But the Big Five are cross-cultural, linked to genetics, and fairly stable across the lifespan. Most change occurs in early childhood and the later years of life. But if you want to learn more, I've thrown up some links here. Personalityresearch.org, you can get a lot of the theoretical information. And then openpsychometrics.org has all kinds of different personality tests. It's got MBTI, Big Five, and several different others. But what are the 5 factors? So we have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I like to remember these with the OCEAN acronym. I like to use that especially in my meteorology work. It's very topically appropriate. So openness refers to curiosity, creativity, and preference for variety. Conscientiousness is a tendency for dependability. Extroversion is just general sociability, social energy and positivity. Agreeableness is compassion, empathy, cooperation, those kinds of things. And then neuroticism is basically emotional instability. I see here I have a typo in the slide, but that's emotional instability, not stability. And so we see some differences in personality between the genders, men and women. No significant differences for openness. Women trend higher in conscientiousness, but this isn't stable cross-culturally. And you don't tend to find significant differences across the various facets, lending themselves to overall trait difference. Extroversion, women trend higher both at the global and local levels. There are some differences in the facets. And then women tend to be both more agreeable and more neurotic. And so how does this translate to the workplace? We see openness, conscientiousness, and extroversion, as well as emotional stability linked to positive job performance. And of the 5 traits, conscientiousness is the strongest single predictor of job success. Agreeableness has been linked to management positions. And here's a really nice paper reviewing some of those differences and reviewing a number of studies that looked at some of these on-job differences. But my work has been largely concerned with meteorologists and personality, meteorologists and cognitive style, decision-making, that kind of thing. And so last year, I actually did a study, and we found that compared to other physical scientists, we looked at physicists and engineers, meteorologists as a group were more conscientious and extroverted. And a study that I've just finished recently, working on the paper now, I actually looked at meteorologists more deeply on their own. So I was able to compare the subgroups, weather service, broadcast, academic, etc. And we looked at not only personality to replicate that previous work, but also workplace well-being. And so for statistical purposes, we had similar group sizes for weather service and broadcast. I combined everyone else into an overall other group, just so that we would have 3 fairly consistent group sizes. But here you can see the cross meteorological sector personality tendencies. We see that the weather service folks tend to be most conscientious and neurotic. Broadcasters tend to be more open and extroverted. And then the other group, the academics, the consulting meteorologists, and others in the private sector and non-NWS operational were more agreeable. And then, of course, across the bottom, I've got overall group means for each. So workplace well-being, we found several different individual differences between the job sectors, not only in the personality traits I just mentioned, but also burnout, job satisfaction, and anxiety. So broadcasters who were more sociable were also more significantly burnt out, both at work and personally. They were also most anxious and, of course, most extroverted. Weather service meteorologists were most burnout and working with partners. That made sense to me. Everything flows through the weather service. You're dealing with emergency managers. You're working with the broadcasters directly. Everything kind of flows through the weather service. So working with partners, that made sense. Broadcasters, that made sense. They're dealing with the public. They're always on. Social media engagement, pressure at the station, and just the general course of the job. It's very demanding. So those results made sense. The other category that had the private sector, academia, etc., they were more agreeable. They had higher job satisfaction. And there were several, a large percentage of that group, I believe, was self-employed consulting meteorologists. And so I think that has a lot to do with the job satisfaction, more independence, a lot less bureaucracy, and things like that to deal with. The joys of being self-employed. But there were no cross-sector differences in other traits that I think might be more relatively uniform across meteorologists as a whole. And so I looked at grit, which is basically like resilience. I looked at life orientation, which is positivity. We looked at life satisfaction, self-concept clarity, which is it's basically self-awareness, if I were to put it in simpler terms. And then we also looked at happiness, stress, and depression. And there were no differences in any of those variables. So I kind of felt like, the job is very demanding and everything tends to work out in terms of positivity, grit. You're going to find across the board generally stable people. I was having a conversation the other day on Twitter, and meteorologists, broadcasters in particular, are very, very tough people. They put up with quite a lot from the public. And I'm sure the recent tornado outbreak, we saw that quite a bit. But very, very tough people. And so grit, positivity, life satisfaction, self-awareness, all those things, it made sense that there were no differences. But that's what I had for you, and I'm happy to take questions either here or later, if there are any to be had.
Hey, Matt, this is Tim.
Yep.
Can you go back to the slide that was talking about how meteorologists, I don't know if it was NWS meteorologists or just meteorologists in general, kind of scored differently than other physical scientists?
Yes.
So, and the question that I would have here is, since you did it in 2018, and is this just for meteorologists in general?
That one, we looked at meteorologists in general, yes.
Okay. So, I was thinking that since meteorology is becoming a more more weighted towards reaching out to work with our partners in the NWS. Broadcasters already do a lot of outreach. They're always, being, out in front of people and things like that. And now the NWS is pushing kind of in that same direction, in that we're, instead of being just sitting closeted in your forecast office and putting out your forecasts every day, you're going out to meeting partners and things like that. Do you think that's something that is recent, a recent change that we've kind of scored differently than other physical scientists, or is it just something that we've always kind of been that way?
I agree. I do think it's recent. But something you have to consider with physicists and engineers is that those are desk jobs. Those are, lab jobs. And the fact that meteorologists are getting out more, that would definitely affect that. The other things we looked at in that study, so we looked at personality, but we looked at mental health as well, stress, depression, and anxiety. And the physicists and engineers were together and I believe independently. I don't have that paper in front of me. But together and I believe independently, they were more stressed, depressed, and anxious than meteorologists. And what we saw in the correlations with personality seemed to suggest that those some of these traits, the extroversion, the conscientiousness, seem to lend themselves to a bit of a protective factor against those mental health tendencies. Just to round out that paper, we looked at 2 cognitive styles. We found meteorologists to be higher in empathy than physicists and engineers. And we also found them to be higher at the individual level, I believe it was, in something called systemizing, which is attention to detail. And so meteorologists presented for this sample a very interesting cognitive profile, in that they were higher in attention to detail and higher in empathy. And psychological theory, it's called the empathizing systemizing theory, holds that if you're stronger in attention to detail, you'll be lower in empathy, and vice versa. And so meteorologists, in our view, tend to be more balanced. They're strong in attention to detail. You've got that analytical thinking, but then you've also got the empathy, the agreeableness, the extroversion. The fact that meteorology is a helping field, inherently, it made sense to us that they were also high in empathy. Physicists and engineers, they might be involved in construction, obviously, but it's not quite as an empathic job as interfacing with the public to provide warnings and watches and so on. But we also looked at autistic traits among physicists, engineers, and meteorologists. And meteorologists were not higher than physicists and engineers, but they were similar in terms of traits of autism. And I did that because previous work had looked at physicists and engineers and found links to autism. So I wanted to see if those extended outwards to meteorologists as well. But they were similar in terms of autistic traits.
I've always been people thought that, at least in the NWS, I know that I've heard people say that we're all a bunch of introverts. And so I find it interesting that your study found that in general, and I know that also includes the meteorologists in the broadcast industry, but in general, we were more seen as more extrovert than anything. So I found that kind of interesting.
I know I personally score as an introvert on the MBTI test, and actually a very strong introvert. However, I think my my empathy and my willingness to help others and, try to make a difference in terms of people's lives and how weather affects people's lives, that I think overcomes my introvertedness or my preference, I guess you could say, towards being an introvert. And because a lot of people are surprised, they would have expected me to be an extrovert because I am always out there, with our partners, or just out there networking with other meteorologists and getting to know them and understanding, their challenges and just being a person to talk to, I guess you could say. And so I don't know. I just find that really interesting that, like Tim said, a lot of NWS meteorologists are seen more as the introverted style, but I think we introverts sort of I don't want to say overcome that, because it's not a bad trait.
Right.
That's who I am, and I'm very proud of that. It's just the way I think differently than some others. But I do recognize that, and I think that's a strength of the test, is that you can recognize that and find ways to maybe put yourself out there a little bit more, get yourself out of your comfort zone and do the job well. And so for me personally, that's how these tests, personality tests, really help in my world and my job.
Well, and that's exactly right. I think we talk about the MBTI as being not scientific, because it's got those psychometric issues. But anything that's going to help you understand yourself better, I think, is a plus. I generally find most of the types, those descriptors, to be accurate, at least for me and what I've observed in other people. Now, would I go and use that scientifically? No, but I think it gives a good general indication. And two, people often confuse introversion and what that term means. They think that introverts can't be social, and this goes back to what you're saying, kind of
right.
Overcoming. It's not that you're antisocial, but that you are, you're drawing your energy from that solitude. You're drawing energy from introspection. You're not going out and, you don't have to be the life of the party.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I love my friends and I love networking. I really enjoy that, but I really enjoy also going back to my own private space,
Right.
and that's a-okay.
Hey, Matt, I got a question for you.
Yep.
So we got a bunch of people watching. They're all probably meteorologists, and maybe the question they're asking is, great, how does this help me do my job? How does understanding my personality or understanding somebody else's personality help me forecast thunderstorms, or something like, how does just understanding that help us do our jobs?
Well, I think in terms of personality, it's knowing how you think, how you're going to respond under pressure. Personality isn't going to necessarily help you when it comes to forecasting, but it's going to help you in the ways that you react to your coworkers, to the public. You'll take that criticism a bit better. If you're more neurotic, you won't receive that very well. But if you're emotionally stable, then you can kind of shrug it off a bit better. It's the cognitive styles that really help in forecasting, that systemizing, that attention to detail, being able to pick out a trough or another upper air feature more readily. It's the balance between that and the empathy. And that too is going to interact with personality and how you handle the burnout, how you handle some of those other factors I was talking about, the stress, depression, anxiety. I know one thing that we looked at in the survey was whether or not people wanted to leave meteorology. And I think it was something like 57% of the sample. Now, we had almost 400 people. It was a pretty good sample, just considering, you know, my resources. And it was fairly representative across the field and in the different sectors. But 57% of meteorologists surveyed wanted to leave the field at some point. And so the empathy and the systemizing interplay there is going to also play into that. You know, if you're more logical, you're more likely to shrug off some of these self-criticisms. You can kind of disconnect from the event better. Whereas if you're more empathic, you know, maybe you're perseverating on the impacts and, oh man, I really should have done better, even though it wasn't your fault. You did the best you could in your forecast, but you know, you hear people died in the event, and you might be really, really hard on yourself.
Well, you know, and also in this age of social media, you know, whether you're in the broadcast or in the NWS office, especially in broadcast, it's just a constant barrage of how you messed up the forecast and things like that. And like you mentioned before, that the broadcasters scored a little better, that they're able to kind of let that kind of go. And I know that's been a struggle, you know, as I've talked with other NWS meteorologists. That's a struggle because that's something we just, until we started opening up that Pandora's box of social media, that we were kind of insulated from the public, and now they can send their comments directly to us, and many times they are not afraid to let us know what they think, kind of thing.
Yeah, which is good and bad at the same time.
Yes.
But you know, and this sort of lends it. Sorry, Matt, you mentioned earlier that, you know, we meteorologists sort of are considered stable and very tough people, but you know, at the same time, you know, don't let that. I just wanted to make sure that people listening to this webinar understand, yeah, you're tough, but don't be afraid. I mean, we're all going to have the moments where we're not feeling so tough, and you know what, that's totally okay. And it's really important to take care of yourself. If you're feeling overwhelmed, or you know, an event didn't quite go the way that you had hoped that it would go, and so you're sort of feeling like you're taking it all upon yourself, that it was your fault or this, you know, just know that it's not your fault. You tried the best you could, and to go talk to somebody if you can, just to relieve some of those feelings that that might be welling up inside you, because being tough doesn't mean that, you know, you have to shrug it off completely. that's not healthy. So just take care of yourself and know that you know, we're out there if you want to talk ever about the tough stuff. There's you know, a lot of us are out there willing to share stories. We've all been through there. We've all been there. It's not fun, but you know, we do it because that's our job, and we find ways to relieve the stress, the anxiety, and the terrible feelings that come out if an event goes south. So I just wanted to bring up that point.
That's great. I'll add to it. Becky DePodwin at AccuWeather has actually been writing on mental health and some of her experiences. She, Dakota Smith, a few others actually put together a panel at AMS. They talked about some of these issues. She actually has a recent blog post. She put together all kinds of different resources for mental health counseling, meditation, yoga, all different things that can help. And there's a whole community out there. We're involved in active discussion on this stuff. So yeah, definitely, if you're comfortable and want to talk about things, don't hesitate to reach out.
You know, one of the other things that I going back to helping you do your job, I've taken, like you've mentioned, several of these personality profiles, and it's helped me understand myself and some of my how I trend up and down, and better understand how, like you said, I react to different situations. But it also helped me to understand my coworkers, and then if I better understand them, and to an extent, you can also extrapolate this to any partners or anybody that you have to work with outside the office. You can begin to tailor your information, your presentation that you're giving to them so that they can better receive it. If you've got a boss who, there's a couple kinds of bosses. Either there's a bottom line boss, or there's a boss that needs all wants all the details. If you go into the bottom line boss and then start to give them all the, oh, I did A, B, C, D, and E, they're like, please, you're killing me here. Just jump down to Z and let me know what the bottom line is. That will help you, work with your coworkers, and like I mentioned, to the extent of, we can also help meet the needs of our various partners that you also have to work with outside the office.
Yeah, great point. And to go along with that, to sort of not just meet the needs, but anticipate the needs of your coworkers and your partners and, the general public when you're posting on social media or whatnot. It's important also to anticipate what their reaction might be. I found that to, understanding my coworkers, I found that to be super useful in presenting them the information. Sort of like what Tim was describing. You've got your bottom line boss and you've got your details boss, and you don't want to go in there and present them with something that they're just going to glaze over their eyes and be like, oh boy, here we go.
Yep.
So one point that I thought was interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that the academic and research community is in general much happier, much is that correct? Maybe happier is not quite the right term.
That group had it had academia, it had who else? It had private sector, which could include AccuWeather folks. It could include self-employed consulting meteorologists, and that's kind of where I think the higher job satisfaction came from.
Yeah, I just found that fascinating, because I know in the academic and research world, they're very focused on getting grants and having to write papers in order for their career to progress and maintain. And personally, I feel like that would be such a struggle, and perhaps that's not my expertise, but knowing some folks in that world and just seeing some of the stresses they deal with, I was sort of surprised to hear that job satisfaction was sort of higher in that group. I don't think I actually have a question about that. I just wanted to bring that up as a comment, and something that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, in follow-up work, I want to get into that more, because I didn't, after I had them list, what general sector, like if they listed private sector, I didn't have them go any deeper than that. So I don't know how many of them, for example, I mean, there were, I believe, 41 people in the private sector. I think they were the largest subgroup of the other category. So that could have been, it could have been a bunch of AccuWeather employees. It could have been a bunch of consulting meteorologists. I'm not exactly sure past that general private sector headline, what those folks did. But those are my general thoughts on the topic.
Well, I'm not sure I see any more questions. Tim, do you have any?
Yeah, we talked about the difference between being an extrovert and an introvert, and I like to, like Becca, I surprise people when I tell people I'm a very high introvert, but I've learned the skills that, like Becca mentioned, that there's times that I have to put myself out in front of other people, and I do it well enough to the point where people go, he's an extrovert, and I am in no way. I much prefer to be in the background and just pushing the buttons behind the scenes. I don't feel that need. But if you are, like, let's say, an introvert, and you're thrust into a position where you have to be extroverted, and again, knowing this about yourself, do you, I could see on the one hand, you could use this as an excuse to say, no, that is just not me. Or can you
Right.
use some of this knowledge that, yes, I'm an introvert, but I can move into the situation that's been presented with me and do it well. Is there anything that we can take from this to help us to better do when we're thrown into a situation where our personality goes against what our natural personality is?
Yeah, I definitely think the knowledge can help. It can serve as a coping mechanism of sorts. I know I'm very, very high introvert, but when I'm at a conference, that's my thing. And I think most people, they come away saying, oh, he's pretty extroverted. He starts talking, I can't get him to stop. I've spoken to people, I'll talk your ear off if it's the right subject. But knowing that, it was always, but before I knew about personality in depth, it was always, oh, okay, I have to go out and talk to people, like you were just saying. But knowing that, it's like, okay, this is how I am naturally, but how can I make small adjustments? And that's where, you start working on your body language, and different things like that in your presentation, and your self-monitoring, and you start to notice these changes as you pick up this presence. You start to be more comfortable outside of your more typical configuration, you could say.
I'll just give a quick example right now. Doing these webinars, being an introvert, this is way out of my comfort zone. But I've learned how to deal with it, and in practice, I've done a couple of these now, and I've had some great mentors along the way who have helped me, become the webinar team leader that I am. But I also have lots of notes that I always bring to the table to make sure that I am well prepared in things that I want to talk about or ask questions I want to ask. And it also very much so, like you were saying also earlier, Matt, that knowing the people that you're talking with and having that comfort level between us has been also extremely helpful. So so those are a few tips, tricks that I have learned over the past few years or so on how to become a little bit more comfortable in this communicating with people and in this sort of environment.
And then Matt, you mentioned Becky over at AccuWeather. I think I found her article here. She actually tweeted it. So this is just to show you guys, talking about how mental health and can affect you as far as your job. But I wanted to throw this out here because she tweeted it at us, and she's actually listening to the presentation. But I want to applaud her for writing this up and everything. Let me come back here to you guys here. Woo, it's always exciting.
Jennifer lost connection, sadly, but she sent me this one note that the one other thing she wanted to bring to the table, to this conversation, is that meteorologists being pushed into the public more is simply the idea of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence. Many companies and management training focuses on the subject as it is related to business, and I think the popularity of the notion is helping to drive the public interaction rather than just staying in front of the computer, just being behind the screen, just forecasting. So yeah, can you speak a little bit about that term, emotional intelligence?
Emotional
Tell us what it means.
Yes. It gets into that, some of that introversion and introspection, being able to sort through your own emotions, being able to read others. You get into a related concept called cognitive empathy, which deals with perspective taking. It gets into affective empathy, which deals with responding to emotions, other people's, your own, etc. But it involves reading all kinds of different cues, body language, nonverbals, but also verbals, and it's all those things, and it's really a helpful thing. It helps you sort through it helps you sort through conflict. You can get to the problem. You can cut through maybe your own emotional conflicts with the situation. Be a little more analytical about it and know how to approach different situations. But emotional intelligence in the workplace is extremely important as well. Group projects, collaborations, conflict. There's really no situation where it can't be useful. Yeah, I mean, we could talk a little bit about that more if you wanted.
I think this entire aspect of the science of personality and cognitive function and how it relates to meteorologists. I think we could talk about this for days. But we should probably wrap it up here.
Conference
soon.
Organizers, if you're out there, we need a sub-conference.
Yeah, a whole day on this topic. How about that?
I'll be co-chair.
There we go. Yeah, we could branch it or split it up into the different science categories of
Yes.
cognitive behavior and
go.
function, and then mental health and all that good stuff. Yeah.
Yep.
Because again, like I had mentioned earlier, it's something we don't talk about it all that much. I mean, it's becoming a more popular topic, which is awesome. And I think the more that people can dive into the science and understand, I mean, we're all scientists, so that we sort of understand the science. We can have a tendency to perhaps understand the science a little bit better, and how it could relate to our own workplace environment and our behavior and our own emotional intelligence. And I think bringing it to light has been really, really good over the past few years, and I hope we continue to do so. Any final thoughts?
Well, I'll ask Matt. Are you continuing to do research in this area?
Yes, we're writing up that workplace well-being paper now. Hoping to get that published in the next few months, and then I'm going to be doing another study. I'm not quite sure what I'm measuring yet, but I want to expand on some of these things, look at them in a bit more detail. So look for that survey soon.
Will do. All right. Thank you, Matt, for such an enlightening talk. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah. We should do it again, maybe in 2 months, right?
Yeah, right.
We're going to have Matt back for the May webinar, if I remember correctly.
Talking about mentoring.
Yeah. And thank you, Tim, for your great discussion and your help here on the webinar. Also, a big thanks to Hannah Strong for live tweeting today's webinar. Next month, we will hear from the awards committee on the NWA awards process and how you can pay it forward by nominating your peers for an award. So mark your calendars for April 10th at 12 p.m. Central Daylight Time. We'll see you then. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.